I'm now absolutely delighted to introduce you to our guest, Dr. Tilly Blyth, who is Keeper of Technology and Engineering at the London Science Museum. Tilly has a degree in physics at the University of Manchester and a PhD in social construction of information and communications technology from Brunel University, London. Dr. Blyth will today talk about one of Britain's greatest mathematicians, to reveal how Alan Turing impacted the development of computing and programming, and also the influence of the development of machine and artificial intelligence, the structure of molecules, and work on morphogenesis. So, Dr. Blyth, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Tilly Blyth, and I'm Keeper of Engineering and Technology at the Science Museum in London. It's a great pleasure to be with you here today, and I'd like to thank the Science and Innovation section from the British Embassy for inviting me to give this talk in the prestigious Science Cafe lectures for this amazing science festival. It's a real honour to be able to join in with you all today. I would also like to thank Viola Yakikova from the organising committee of the Science Festival for inviting me to come and talk to you. Before I start, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the work that I do in London. The Science Museum is part of a group of 5 museums, and we are based all across Britain, all of those 5 museums. The Science Museum is in London, and we care over 7 million artefacts across the whole range of disciplines, from engineering, science, media, technology, medicine. So really the whole range of heritage across Britain. Our heritage actually goes back to something called the Great Exhibition in 1851, which was held in the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park in London, and was part of a big celebration of Victorian engineering and art. As Keeper of Technologies and Engineering, I have probably the best job in the museum, and certainly I'm very pleased to be there, because I get to look after some of the most significant artefacts that we hold in the museum. So I look after Stephenson's rocket locomotive, one of the earliest locomotives in the world. I look after the Apollo 10 capsule, space capsule, and I'm also responsible for Charles Babbage's difference engines, and these were some of the earliest machines looking at calculation and computation created in Victorian times. Our Science Museum in London has over 3 million visitors every year, and this is increasing every year, so we're very proud of the programme that we have. And we also reach out into schools as well as directly through the museum itself. So I've been asked to talk to you today about Alan Turing and his life and legacy. He was one of the world's greatest mathematicians and computer scientists. And it is a centenary celebration because he was born in 1912, 100 years ago. For this centenary, the Science Museum decided to host an exhibition examining his life and his work. We felt very strongly that Alan Turing had not received the recognition that he deserved, and that certainly in Britain, or perhaps internationally, very few people knew about the extent of his spheres of influence in mathematics and computer science. We were also very lucky to receive funding from Google, the search company, who enabled the exhibition to happen. I approached them about 2 years ago with one side of paper and said, we really need to do this exhibition, and they fully supported us and gave us full funding for the exhibition, which really made it happen. So today, I'd like to talk to you about the exhibition itself and some of the artifacts that you'll find there. We called the exhibition Codebreaker because Alan Turing was known for his code-breaking work at Bletchley Park, during the Second World War, when he broke the German Enigma machine code. But Turing is perhaps less well known, and also has an enormous influence in many other areas, and those are some of the things I'm going to talk to you about today. So the four areas that I'd like to talk about are computer science, its influence in cryptography, thirdly, his development around ideas in artificial intelligence, and also finally his work on biology and science in morphogenesis, where he looked at the patterns in nature. And as I talk about these four areas, I'd like to show you that the work that he undertook and the directions he went in were completely related to his life experiences. Turing was often very difficult to work with, but he was not a man who lived in isolation from others. He shared his ideas, and he didn't see mathematics as a separate thing from his life around him, but as reflecting and questioning the world that he lived in. It was this that allowed Alan Turing to be a very maverick thinker and to think in completely different ways to some of the other people that he worked with. He took his work in new and diverse directions and addressed areas that had not previously been thought about in mathematical thought. So, Alan Turing was born in 1912 in a place called Maida Vale in North London. His mother and father both lived in India. His father was part of the Indian Civil Service, and his mother was a daughter of the chief engineers of the Madras Railways. His parents spent most of their time in India, but they wanted their son to be born and brought up in Britain, so they sent him to a very prestigious private school called Sherborne School in Dorset. And from an early age, he showed a very strong inclination towards mathematics and science. In 1931, Turing went to study at King's College in Cambridge, and in 1935 he was elected a fellow at Cambridge. And whilst at Cambridge, Turing wrote one of his most significant papers on computable numbers, with an application to the Entscheidungs problem. And it's this paper that sets out the fundamental basis of computer science today, and is really the first part of his groundbreaking work. So in Turing's 1936, in his 1936 paper, he set out to solve a major conundrum that was vexing mathematicians at the time. The German mathematician David Hilbert had written about the Entscheidungs problem, or the decision problem. Hilbert wanted to know if all mathematical statements were decidable. So Turing showed that there was no solution to show whether any mathematical statement was true or false. So it's very simple to show that 2 plus 2 equals 4, but a more complex function is much more harder to show whether there is a final solution. In this paper, Turing describes a theoretical machine that we now know as the universal machine. He described a device that manipulates symbols on an infinite strip of tape according to a set of logical instructions. And he proved that this universal machine could be capable of performing any conceivable mathematical computation, as long as the mathematical problem was represented as a series of logical steps. And of course, this is what we now think of as an algorithm, and the machine that he was describing is essentially the central processing unit of a computer that we produce today. So whilst trying to solve what was just a mathematical problem, Turing had described a theoretical device which is subsequently the model for all of our modern computers today. But for Turing, this universal machine was just a thought experiment. For many others, it signalled the birth of computing, and it was certainly for then the engineers to take that forward and build that into real physical machines that could do calculation for us. Of course, people were already doing computing, as you can see from this slide. there were many people who were using other forms of machine for calculation. So up until the Second World War, the word computer had actually meant often winning, doing calculation, doing computing. But they did this using adding machines or manually. And here, this picture is from 1934, from a mathematician at Manchester University called Douglas Hartree and his student Arthur Porter. They developed an electromechanical machine, an analog computer that was one of the first in the world. And this differential analyzer, here being shown being demonstrated, it literally used shafts and gears to physically model a mathematical relationship. It was not until the Second World War that we began to see digital electronic machines appearing based on the idea of Alan Turing's universal machine. Turing himself devised one of these very first early digital electronic machines in 1946. He worked after the Second World War in a place called the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington, outside of London. And there he developed a machine known as the Automatic Calculating Engine, the ACE computer. Due to the delays on the project, the pilot version of his machine was not actually finished until 1950. But it was one of the world's first universal machines. This machine ran its first program on the 10th of May 1950, and here you can see it with the console on the far left, and with the main processing unit with hundreds of valves in the middle. And in the front, on the bottom right, you can see the mercury delay lines. These were the very early form of memory for the computer, and they're literally filled with liquid mercury. And for the time that a pulse is sent through the mercury is the time that the data is saved in the computer. So a very early form of memory for the machine, but a very interesting way of devising how you would store data. Of course, it's rife with problems, because if the temperature gets hotter, then the delay lines expand, and the mercury expands, and the time it takes to store that data actually takes much longer, so the whole machine becomes out of sync. So it's not too far-fetched to say that looking at this machine, this is the machine actually at the Science Museum in London today, and by looking at this machine, I think we can say that we're actually looking at aspects of Alan Turing's mind made of glass and metal. It's the only physical manifestation of Turing's concept of a universal machine, one in which Turing himself was directly involved in the design. And we're incredibly lucky that this machine still exists with us today. It's only thanks to the foresight of a few people at the National Physical Laboratory that decided that when the machine came out of service in 1956, that it should be donated to the Science Museum, and it is still with us today. And sadly, that's not the case for many of those early machines, such as the Colossus or Colossi computers that we use at Bletchley Park, or the EDSAT machine, the Electronic Delay Storage Automatic Calculator that was at Cambridge University, or indeed the small electronic computing machine, the MESO, that was used in Russia. These were all reportedly destroyed, and as people who developed them were not aware of their historical significance. So what was the pilot ACE actually used for? Well, at the time, these machines were known as electronic brains. That's how they were presented in the press, as a way of helping people to understand what a computer actually was. And they were created for easy calculation in mainly scientific research, and they were used for rapid and complex calculation. But here's one example of a very practical use that the pilot ACE was put to.